The producers of this film would like to thank the following treatment centers for their generous support. New Roads Behavioral Health of Cottonwood Heights, Utah. Ascend Recovery of American Fork, Utah. Casa Palmera of Del Mar, California. Lighthouse Recovery Center of Midvale, Utah. Phoenix Recovery and Counseling Centers of Draper, Utah. And the Ranch at Dove Tree of Lubbock, Texas. Additional support was provided by the Utah Support Advocates for Recovery Awareness, and by the following corporate sponsors and foundations: Apple Spice Junction Bakery and Catering, Megadyne International Electrosurgical Products, the Children's Friend Foundation, the O.C. Tanner Company, and by the J. Willard and Alice S. Marriott Foundation. Thank you.
It was never one big decision I made to become an addict. It was a bunch of little decisions, little personal boundary violations that, over time, added up. And before long, I had a big problem. The same was true for my recovery. I never made one big decision to get sober. It was a series of little decisions that, taken together, protected me, kept me safe from my own brain. But when I finally emerged from my addiction and realized all I had lost, what I wanted most was to be alone. And so I came here, to the deserts of southern Utah.
I used to have the best job in the world. I was a flight surgeon in the United States Navy. I was the doctor for a squadron of Marine Corps FA-18 pilots. Now, pilots do not ordinarily trust doctors. There's an old saying, don't go to the flight surgeon can never help you. But over time, I did gain the trust of my pilots, and they did come to me with their problems, and we solved them, and in the end, the squadron was safer. Over time, they knew that I was their advocate, that I would fight for them. I used to tell them, the only reason I have gold wings on my chest is to protect the gold wings on your chest. I loved being a flight surgeon, and I wanted to do it for the rest of my life. And then I made a terrible mistake.
It started with a surgery I had to stay physically fit to fly.
After my surgery, they prescribed me oxycodone, that's OxyContin today, Percocet in the old days. Now, opioids affect people in different ways. Some people do not like them. They crawl out of their skin. Most people have a little euphoria and they quickly forget about it. But some people, when they take opioids for the first time, it is a life-changing experience. That was me, and it wasn't long before I was forging prescriptions for Demerol. Now, there were times when I hid my addiction. I wanted to get away with it. But there were also times that I wanted to stop. In a moment of strength, I would tear up my triplicate prescriptions, and then in a moment of weakness, I'd just find some other way to get them.
I was licensed in California. The medical board published a quarterly newsletter, and on the back was the number to the diversion program. A doctor who thought he had a problem with drugs could call the number, get help, and save his license.
I struggled with that decision to make the call. Sometimes I thought I could quit on my own, Other times I thought I could control my use of Demerol. But I knew I had to make the call. I desperately did not want to hurt a patient.
Finally, I picked up the phone. The woman who answered was very compassionate. She told me to go that night to a diversion meeting in Fountain Valley and talk to a man named Jack Sano. She said he had helped many, many doctors in my same situation. I had no idea what I was walking into. I figured there was a 50-50 shot that I'd be arrested on the spot. I walked in, and sitting around a table was a group of doctors who knew exactly what I was going through, and I knew from that point on that recovery was possible.
Jack suggested that I go to treatment.
I told him that was impossible. I was in the military. I would be court-martialed the minute I admitted my addiction.
The doctors in diversion were very welcoming. They let me come to their meetings, and they taught me a lot. But because of my dilemma, they really didn't know what to do with me. I tried hard to stay sober. I'd put together a couple weeks, but I'd always relapse. Eventually, the Navy caught me pilfering Demerol from the branch clinic pharmacy. They knew exactly what to do with me.
Well, what did I expect? In the end, my worst fears came true. The Navy court-martialed me and sent me to Leavenworth. The chief of staff of the prison came to my cell. He told me he had read my record and that I seemed like a pretty good guy who got himself into a jam. He suggested I try to figure out what got me here, do my time, and then go home and get on with my life.
I thought that was a pretty fair offer, so I took him up on it.
I set out to learn everything I could about addiction. I read every book I could get my hands on, every journal article. I wanted to know what was going on in my brain and if there was a reason, beyond just being a bad person, that I had violated the values to which I once held myself.
I still have my books from Leavenworth with my inmate number written on the inside. It was in that cell that I really started to think about whether or not addiction could be a disease. These books were very precious to me. And as I read them, I came to know the greatest minds in addiction research. Nora Volkoff, George Koob, Anna Rose Childress, Bill White. Their words gave me hope that someday I might recover and maybe regain my license to practice medicine.
I spent a year at Leavenworth, and then I went straight to treatment.
I think I was the happiest person to ever enter treatment. But I had a problem. Even after all that I had been through and all that I had lost, I still wanted to use drugs.
I sat in group therapy trying to focus on my treatment, but all I could think about was Demerol. Everything reminded me of Demerol. I saw it everywhere. I could choose not to use drugs, but I couldn't seem to choose not to crave. This was the worst my craving ever got, and I felt terribly guilty for having any desire to go back to using drugs. But I had no idea how to make it stop.
At that point, my biggest adversary was my own brain.
And the advice from my counselors was, well, less than helpful. Not that I needed any reminding of why I needed to stay sober. 2 weeks into treatment, men wearing blue windbreaker jackets burst into my treatment center to arrest me again. Their badges read Medical Board Police.
I had no idea there were medical board police.
Now the state of California prosecuted me for the Demerol prescriptions I had forged.
Any defense I could mount was complicated by the fact that I was guilty.
When we met with the Orange County District Attorney, my lawyer explained that I had voluntarily entered treatment and had a year sober, and that did not impress him one bit. He said, if you're a doctor and you use drugs in Orange County, California, you're going to prison. I tried to explain to him that I had already been to prison. That doesn't count, he said. I mean a California prison.
The judge gave me 6 months in jail, but allowed me to do it in a probation-approved sober living home. That only further irritated the Orange County District Attorney, so he demanded 5 years of formal probation. I knew I could never reapply for my medical license if I was on probation, so I asked him, why so long?
Because you're going to relapse, said the DA, and when you do, I'm sending you back to prison.
So next to my own brain, my other adversary was the Orange County Probation Department.
Probation pulled me out of the treatment center that I liked and put me in one of their probation-approved sober living homes. It was a less than pleasant living environment. The first thing the house manager did was sit me down and say, if you use, I'm calling your PO. If you break curfew, I'm calling your PO. If you park in my parking spot, I'm calling your PO, and they will take you to jail.
So my third adversary was my treatment program. So now I faced a triple threat. There was no room for error. If I relapsed, my medical career was over. The medical board might understand one trip to prison, but they would never understand two. So I had to stay sober. But how do you do that? How do you keep yourself from relapsing when there's so much on the line? If punishment hadn't worked up to this point, I couldn't count on it now. So I was in real trouble.
Of all that I had faced so far, this was the darkest time. What do I mean when I say my biggest adversary was my own brain? From my studying at Leavenworth, I had a basic idea of what was behind my craving. There was a giant fight going on in my head between two competing choice systems.
One of them is down here in areas of the brain known as the midbrain and the striatum. This is an automatic system, quick and dirty, but surprisingly good at making correct choices. This system sends pathways of neurons up to the cortex, and the message they carry is go. The other choice system is up here in the cortex. It's a slower, more deliberative system. It sends pathways back down to the midbrain. If the go system makes a bad decision, this system can veto it.
Between the midbrain and the cortex lies the amygdala. There are two of them, and they add an emotional spin to the information going up to the cortex. In addition, my amygdala gives way too much emotional intensity to the signal going up, and the system that says go keeps overpowering the system that says don't go.
So it's all well and good when I make a big, sincere decision to stay sober, but if I want to stick with it, I have to accept how my brain's choice system really works, or doesn't. Then I have to come up with strategies to protect myself when the let's use drugs part of my brain sneaks up on and overpowers the let's don't use drugs part of my brain.
So what makes me think this is a disease process and not just a matter of my own personal weakness?
After all, there's a saying, alcoholics drink alcohol and drug addicts use drugs, not because they have a disease, but because they like the feeling. Yes, that's exactly right. But the aspect of addiction that is so crucial and so difficult to grasp is that as an addict, I have a defect in the like mechanism in my brain.
So how does the brain confer value? It has to recognize and learn things that are good for survival, things like food and sex. To do this, the brain has a reward system. It likes things. Liking is a complex process that involves a bunch of different brain chemicals.
But there is one chemical that all addicting drugs, and it looks like all addicting behaviors, have in common, and that's dopamine. Dopamine is the chemical of reward salience. Anything that releases dopamine gets my attention, tells me it's important, makes me remember it, and allows me to predict it in the future. And this is how I recognize things that are good for survival in the environment and learn them. My brain was designed for nice, even releases of dopamine that go along with natural, normal pleasures. But drugs cause massive surges of dopamine, large and fast spikes, and my brain just wasn't meant to handle this. And in addiction, with each spike, the drug becomes more and more salient until it's the most salient thing, overwhelmingly wanted until it's the most wanted thing, and punishment has to be greater and greater to stop the behavior until finally it just fails.
Dopamine spikes from drugs cause me to give way too much salience, way too much importance, and way too much value to drugs. Not only that, I quickly memorize everything that goes along with them, where I did them, when I did them, with whom I did them. When craving kicks in, I will keep doing the drug even if someone holds a terrible consequence, such as going back to prison, over my head.
If I used even a small amount of drug, or if I overused anything for that matter that spikes dopamine, or if I'm exposed to things that went along with my drug, such as drug cues, people, places, times of day, any of these things could trigger a relapse.
So the first thing I had to do, if I wanted to avoid relapse, was avoid anything that spiked my dopamine. Basically, anything that was intoxicating. The GO system that sends pathways up to my cortex uses dopamine. And those pathways that come back down from my frontal cortex to my midbrain, they use another chemical, glutamate. Glutamate is important in learning. It also inhibits my go behavior by saying don't go. That's how my frontal cortex keeps my midbrain in check. But every time I become intoxicated, massive surges of dopamine and huge floods of glutamate occur in my brain. Not only is the drug hypersalient, but I overlearn it and everything that went along with it.
These flash floods create severe damage to my glutamate system, and that disrupts the control my frontal cortex had over my midbrain. This is part of my craving too. I lose my ability to inhibit my desire to seek out drugs. I can't say don't go. And that's when I relapse.
It takes a long, long time to repair those pathways. Even after I get sober, those channels are still there, waiting patiently for the next flood. So drug cues are the second thing that can trigger relapse. To stay sober, I have to learn strategies to avoid them or cope with them.
But there's a third relapse trigger that's impossible to avoid, and that's stress. All I can do is manage it and try and get it down to size. Now, what do you think that DA would say if I told him I relapsed because I was stressed? He'd probably say, we all face stress, we don't all smoke crack. And then he would throw me in jail. But more and more, research shows that for addiction, for other mental illnesses, for a wide range of chronic diseases, stress matters.
Every time I become intoxicated and my dopamine spikes, my brain responds by turning on its stress system. It releases the stress hormone CRF to bring things back into balance. If you and I were to inject CRF, it would feel as terrible as the drug feels good. If it's just one bout of intoxication, my brain quickly returns to normal. But if I keep using drugs, my brain pushes back with another stress response. Eventually, these repeated intoxications and stress responses lead to one big continuous stress response. Now I'm using drugs just to push back against the constant output of CRF. Over time, the cumulative effect of each episode of intoxication and stress damages my reward system. So strategies to protect myself against relapse are not just avoiding intoxication and coping with drug cues, but very good stress management. And after a lifetime of intoxication and stress, I have my work cut out for me. I love southern Utah, not only because it is so beautiful, but because it is so isolated. There are still canyons here that have never felt a human footprint. I feel safe in this desert, like I can't make any more mistakes out here. At least, not the kind that got me into trouble before. And yet, as lonely as this land is, everywhere you find evidence of how it once teemed with people, a people we call the ancient Puebloans. They were farmers and astronomers and gifted architects. Their buildings were so well constructed, they still stand today. And then suddenly, they disappeared. No one really knows what happened to them. Their impossibly high cliff dwellings suggest defensive protection. But protection from what? Animals? People? What were they afraid of?
I think a lot about the ancient Puebloans. In fact, One of my recurring fantasies is to live in one of their abandoned cliff dwellings, away from the world, inaccessible, well-defended. It just sounds wonderful. But I also happen to know from painful experience, it is a terrible way to stay sober.
Now, why should that be? Why is isolation supposed to be so dangerous for people in recovery?
Well, it has to do with the way our brains are constructed. You see, we are social creatures, and all the things that we do, believe, reason, love, create, build buildings, perform surgery, fly airplanes, require social connectedness. And so it turns out that choice, the kind that really matters, emerges from our sense of community.
So far, we've talked about what goes wrong in the lower reward structures of the brain, down in the deep canyons of survival drives and animal emotions.
I didn't talk a lot about what goes wrong in the cortex, up here in the bumps and grooves. In fact, I deliberately downplayed the cortex because I find what goes wrong here very frightening. In the midst of my addiction, there seem to be 3 areas of the brain that we know of now that become impaired, that don't work correctly. One of them is over here, the orbitofrontal cortex. This is the part of my brain where I give value to things, to people, to objects, to ideas. And so what goes wrong here may be what's behind the overwhelming value I give to drugs relative to the things that deep down I truly care about. So it turns out that valuation is an important component of volition. And when this goes, I lose the steering mechanism for my decision making. Now, another area of the brain that's important in addiction is over here, the anterior cingulate cortex. This is the part of my brain where I pick up on social cues and guide my behavior accordingly. So one way of thinking about this part of the brain is that this is where I see myself through the eyes of others. And so when this goes, I lose my ability to understand what I look like. My behavior becomes very inflexible, extremely rigid. I can't take into consideration the opinions of other people, and I can't see how my behavior is harming the people around me. Now, there's increasing research that this part of the brain over here, the insular cortex, is also important in addiction. This is the part of my brain where I attach my consciousness to my body, and so it's important in self-awareness. And when this goes, that may be what's behind my intense craving, my inability to see how my thinking is wrong on things, and the fact that I deny parts of my addiction. But it's not only these areas of the cortex that are important, it's the way they communicate that matters. There are pathways of neurons that link one to the other, and together they allow me to make choices that reflect my values and help me live socially. But these are precisely the capacities, volition, valuation, self-awareness, that collapse in the midst of my addiction. Not only is my decision-making horribly impaired, but, and this is the scary part, I lose insight into just how impaired I am. I can't see how my behavior is self-defeating, harms the people that I care about, and violates my deepest values. If I'm to have any hope of recovery, I need the give and take of social interaction. I need other people, and they need me. So what does this brain state look like? Well, I'll use myself as an example. I went to treatment at a small program in East San Diego County. My mother came to our family program, and when the family program was over, I got a pass and we went to lunch. It was a beautiful sunny day on Coronado Island. We sat by the water, and when I felt the time was right, I put my hand on hers and I said, "Mom, I love you very much, and I'm very grateful to you for sticking by me through all of this. I want you to know I love sobriety. I see a real future in recovery. And, Mom, I met the greatest girl here in treatment. Oh, we are so in love. I just know you're going to love her too. She gets out of detox next Tuesday. Maybe we can all go to lunch." There it is, that tragic combination of terrible decision-making plus my own loss of insight into how terrible it is. You know, there are a lot of diagnostic signs in medicine. Signs are things that you see and you know you're dealing with a specific disease. There's Babinski's sign in neurology, Levine's sign in cardiology, very diagnostic of a heart attack. I think it's high time that we had our own sign in addiction medicine. And because I'm not grandiose at all, I'm going to call it Macaulay's sign. What is Macaulay's sign? You don't see it in the patient, you see it in the people around the patient. It is that little wrinkle that appears between the eyebrows, right here. It's not really pity, it's not so much anger, it's more, are you completely out of your mind? You can see it on my mother, right there. Very diagnostic of addiction. I saw Macaulay's sign a lot back in those days. In my mother, most of my sponsors, all of my attorneys, a judge or two. I see it less today, but every now and then it pops up. That little furrow right here that asks, are you completely insane? Well, yeah, kinda. You know, I'm making a joke here, but this is the brain state that really characterizes addiction. This is where we're frustrating, where we're misunderstood, and where we're very, very vulnerable. A lot of people exploit addicts in this brain state. I think that volition is so central to our self-concept as human beings that when we see it fail in another person, for instance, when choice collapses in an addict, we feel an intense and irresistible urge to control that other person. And so we try to control them, and it doesn't work. And when it doesn't work, we get angry. And when we get angry, we punish. Much of what we do to addicts in this country, even that which calls itself treatment sometimes, is really punishment. And when we've started to punish, we've as good as failed. You know, I think it's this issue of punishment that's been holding us back from real success in treating addiction. And if we could simply take the punishment out, then people would come to treatment sooner, and they would do better overall. Wouldn't it be nice if I could prove that? Well, how would I prove that? I would need a group of addicts that we didn't punish. That way, if we took the punishment out, we could see if they did better. Well, we do have a group of addicts that we don't punish. And you're going to be a little surprised to hear who they are.
The Navy had a program for dealing with alcohol problems in its air crew. If a pilot thought he had a problem, he could come forward and get treatment. Once he had a strong recovery program in place, the Navy put him back in the cockpit. Under careful monitoring, he could go back to flying.
When the Navy created this program, they did something very new and very brave. They chose to view addiction not as a moral issue, but as a safety issue. The Navy deliberately rejected punishment in favor of risk management, and it worked. Over 90% of the pilots who were treated for alcoholism went back to flying.
This program hasn't been around for 5 years or 10 years. Pilots have been doing this for 4 decades. Commercial airline pilots, too. Their program is referred to as the HIMSS program.
The HIMSS program really started with the physician Richard Masters, who was the ALPA aeromedical advisor, along with 2 pilots, one from Continental and one from United Airlines. They recognized that the problem of addiction existed within pilots, but it was driven underground because of the stigmata and the concern about public safety. But they realized that if pilots had a route to come forward that would still preserve their careers, get them healthy, that the overall safety of the airspace system would be improved. So they came up with a creative project during a time when it was extremely daring to even mention alcohol and pilots in the same context.
The program for professional pilots to be able to receive treatment for drug and alcohol addiction actually was started by the pilots themselves. They were the ones that made the decision that they wanted to be able to get help for their disease, and they wanted to be able to return to the cockpit and fly again.
What we're showing is in the mature airlines programs, we have an abstinence rate of 92% over the course of the pilot's period of monitoring for FAA certification. Over the lifetime of the pilot, to include through the end of their career well beyond the monitoring, our abstinence rates are in the 80 to 85% range. Pilots identify so much of their entire life as pilot. You look at their email addresses, you look at the clothing that they wear, the t-shirts that they have. It's all about aviation. And when you take the opportunity to fly away from a pilot, you've almost robbed them of their entire persona. The leverage is that we can return this persona, make you whole, make you the pilot that you know that you are.
So this is the fascinating science of human error prevention, and it applies to flying fighter jets or operating nuclear power plants or even performing surgery. These are all amazing things that human beings can do, but they all involve risk because humans can make mistakes. We don't run from that risk. We develop procedures to minimize the risk. So you might ask, why did I go to Leavenworth? I thought the Navy had this great program for treating addiction. Well, originally, the Navy did not make a distinction between alcohol and drugs, whether they were oxycodone or heroin. Addiction was addiction, and everyone got treatment. But then, in 1981, there was a mishap on the flight deck of the USS Nimitz, and that changed everything.
It was a dark night at sea, with heavy haze and no visible horizon. A Marine Corps EA-6B Prowler, an electronic countermeasures aircraft with 4 souls on board, was returning to the ship after a training flight. The pilot was a capable aviator, experienced at night carrier landings. But on his first attempt, he boltered, meaning the aircraft did not catch one of the arresting cables on the deck of the ship. So the pilot had to go around for another attempt. On its second approach, the Prowler went bingo. It was now dangerously low on fuel and had to land immediately. The pilot called the ball, had the center line, but at the last moment dropped too low. It struck the ramp and exploded, killing the crew instantly and sending burning fuel and wreckage up the flight deck. The deck crew of the Nimitz fought the fire bravely, and it looked like they had the upper hand. But in the fire, an air-to-air missile on another aircraft detonated, killing many of the crew. In the end, 13 sailors and Marines lost their lives, and 48 more were injured.
On autopsy, it was found that some of the flight deck crew were positive for cannabis. So this was the height of the drug war. The Secretary of the Navy was outraged, and so a zero-tolerance policy was instituted Navy-wide. And just like that, a line was drawn between alcoholism, which resulted in treatment, and drug use, which was punished. That's why I went to Leavenworth. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not a victim. The Navy didn't force me to use drugs, my court-martial was fair, and my punishment was just. But perhaps you can see the danger when zero tolerance wins out over risk management. Because of a political decision, a culture of safety can be turned into a climate of fear. Earlier I said when I became addicted, I made a terrible mistake. But what kind of mistake was it? I can't deny that my actions had intent. There were times that I wanted to get away with it. And for that, I am responsible. But there were also times that I wanted to stop. That shifting intent is called ambivalence. A good safety program makes use of ambivalence and turns it into a window of opportunity. By allowing people to come forward confidentially and admit their mistakes, mishaps can be prevented. Self-reporting is a key concept in the science of safety.
One of the most amazing things humans ever did was travel to the moon. But at first, things did not go well. Rocket after rocket blew up. After one particularly bad explosion, an engineer came forward to the head of NASA's rocket program, Wernher von Braun. The engineer admitted he had short-circuited the rocket's electronics just before launch, causing the explosion.
But von Braun didn't fire the engineer. He sent him this, to reward him for admitting his mistake. Every pilot knows this story, and I've never met a pilot who didn't agree with this approach. That pragmatism, that willingness to set punishment aside for the sake of safety, is a value shared by everyone who works in aviation. We admit our mistakes, we learn everything we can from them, and we make sure we don't repeat them. The greatest things we humans do, heart surgery, commercial aviation, landing on the moon, these things are only possible because of a commitment to a culture of safety. The tragedy of the Nimitz mishap was the change in policy from safety to zero tolerance, whereas programs for pilots and doctors with substance use disorders take the opposite approach. To some, these programs may seem reckless. The first instinct is to throw the alcoholic pilot out or punish the drug-using doctor, and use these as examples to deter others. But time and time again, the science of safety shows that reliance on punishment and deterrence doesn't work. In fact, it creates a work environment that is inherently unsafe. One of the most influential models of human error prevention was developed by British safety psychologist Dr. James Reason. It's called the Swiss cheese model. Dr. Reason understood that for every mishap there is rarely just one cause. There's usually a series of causes, a chain of events leading up to the accident. We put safety procedures in place to prevent each event. These safety procedures are like slices of cheese layered one on top of the other, each slice serving as a barrier or a defense against progression to a mishap. But these defenses aren't perfect. They have holes like Swiss cheese, and each hole serves as a weakness in the defense or a window of opportunity for a mishap to occur. You never really know which defense, which slice of cheese is stronger or weaker at any given time. It's only when you bring them all together that you have maximum protection against the mishap. But if the holes line up, the mishap isn't just likely, it's only a matter of time before it occurs. The power of Dr. Reason's model was its shift in focus from mistakes made by an individual to safety failures in the system within which that person works. It's far easier to make systems safer than individuals, and Dr. Reason's model saved many, many lives.
I remember so clearly the terror of those early days. Of desperately wanting to stay sober, but petrified I would relapse. How was I ever going to stay sober with a head full of craving and prison hanging over it? Then, in the middle of the night, I got it.
As long as I saw this the way that prosecutor did, as a fight with myself between good and evil, I was never going to make it. But if I fell back on my training as a flight surgeon, if I saw this not as a moral problem but as a safety problem, then I could use everything that I knew about mishap prevention and bring that together with what I needed for relapse prevention. So I had to figure out right away, what are my slices of cheese? What are the things that I can put in my life that protect me from relapse? I thought about what we did for our pilots and what I saw the doctors in diversion doing to stay sober. I thought about what slices of cheese they used to protect their recovery. And I knew, if I do what they do, I should be fine. Once I had that dream, things started to look up. I wasn't as afraid anymore. I knew what my slices of cheese would be from watching the doctors and the pilots. My problem was the holes. As a person in recovery, I knew that there would be times in the future when my decision-making would be impaired. But not only that, my insight into my own impairment would be flawed too. I might not be able to correctly judge risks to my recovery. Certainly I would start out strong, but I needed a strategy to stay on track and keep from getting complacent. So how do you fix that? How do you protect yourself from future risk when your ability to recognize risk is itself impaired? Well, what does the science of safety suggest? Well, one strategy that pilots and increasingly doctors use is a checklist. This is the NATOPS Pocket Checklist for the FA-18 Hornet. It contains all of the routine and emergency procedures for the aircraft. Hornet pilots memorize this manual so they can perform everything necessary for safe flight completely, correctly, and consistently. So checklists are an explicit admission that human memory and attention are imperfect, but they are a proven safety practice to avoid making mistakes.
The things the pilots and doctors do, their slices of cheese, if you will, make up a kind of safety checklist. This is what they use to protect themselves from their own faulty thinking.
And these two studies, which were written by some of the finest minds in addiction medicine, describe what state diversion programs require their doctors to do to continue to practice medicine safely in recovery. They're called the blueprint studies because they suggest a model with proven and quite extraordinary success rates that could conceivably be given to everybody.
The blueprint studies attribute the doctor's success to 6 things. First, the doctors went to treatment. After treatment, they engaged in ongoing recovery support in the form of weekly recovery checkups with a therapist or peer monitoring group. Second, the expectation for the doctors was abstinence. If they wanted to be in the program, they couldn't use drugs or alcohol. Third, the doctors each had a relapse plan. Relapses were defined narrowly as any return to drug or alcohol use and resulted in what the authors called swift and certain consequences. Usually that meant returning to inpatient treatment. Fourth, the doctors were tested for drug and alcohol use. They were tested frequently and for the entire 5 years of their monitoring period. Fifth, the doctors enjoyed the fellowship of their recovering peers through mutual support groups. And sixth, the authors of the blueprint studies stated that the professional health programs had leverage. They could advocate for the doctor if he or she was compliant, but they could also threaten loss of their job if they were not.
Well, once I had that checklist, things were easier, but they were by no means easy. I still had 5 years to go and many moments of failed insight to get through. But you know, in those early days, I had the good fortune of meeting some very wise, very kind people, each of whom possessed an excellent understanding of addiction and of recovery. And they said things to me, things that I didn't always understand at first. But they said them in exactly the right way, at exactly the right moment, and I saw things differently after they said them. You know, I'm sober today because I had the benefit of treatment, and I went to a lot of meetings, and I worked a program, and I did what the doctors and the pilots did. But you know, I think I'm sober today because of about a half dozen things that were said to me at exactly the right moment. And then the things that I had to do to stay sober became the things that I wanted to do to stay sober. And so I'll always be grateful to those people and the things that they said to me. And I would want them to know that.
I went to a small treatment program in East San Diego County run by a psychiatrist from Texas named Dr. John Milner. I was lucky that John possesses one of the finest understandings of addiction I've ever encountered. And to describe addiction, he often quoted a line from a Robert Burns poem.
Let me think if I can quote that poem. You had said that...
With some power, the gift to give, to see ourselves as others see us. It will save us from many blunders.
Can you tell me what that means to people who have problems with addiction? What does that say about us?
Well, actually, it says the same thing about most people. However, most people do have some ability to self-assess. We absolutely have lost ours because of the chemicals. The moment you see the radar screen gives you a blip, an image, it goes immediately to the amygdala, and out comes the atomic bomb, boom. So there's no delay.
Yeah.
It's only with the healing brain. And that takes a while.
Yeah. I think that's the scariest part of my addiction, is that my decision-making is impaired and I can't see it.
It is very difficult to accept. In the first 90 days, there is already some healing in the frontal lobes. The radar sweep seems to have slowed down a bit. Mm-hmm. And less and less is getting through, going directly to the amygdala. There's some filtering. Life gets better. I compare it to in the old days of TV when we all had rabbit ears on our TVs. You'd get a good picture. Then it would begin to waffle and wait. You have to fine-tune it, fine-tune it, fine-tune it. And it's like that. And that doesn't really stabilize until 18 months to 2 years.
So what's the strategy then? So let's say in a moment of clarity, I know that this is my disability. I know that even though I'm strong right now, I may not be in a week or in 6 months. What can I do?
The old-timers called it relapse prevention. This is a time when we're strong. We can give, say, a wife or a husband or a mother or a father or a doctor or a therapist or case or a sponsor permission. If we don't give them permission, and they do, we're furious.
Yeah.
But will you give them permission, maybe written, or you give your wife or spouse permission to call you on when your behavior begins to change? If you give them permission, it's going to piss you off, but you'll let it happen. If they do it without, Armageddon. So that's where we began. That's a real simple relapse tool, to give someone permission. Volition. If my mind may be screwed, but you try to interfere with it, I'm going to be all over you.
Once I graduated from John's treatment program, I needed someone who could warn me whenever I slipped back into that brain state of impaired decision-making plus loss of insight. I simply couldn't do this on my own.
This is why John's words rang so true. When I got out of treatment, I felt strong, but I needed to plan for the times that my disease might flare up again. Treatment works, but its effect decays over time. You know, it would be one thing if I had an acute disease like a heart attack or a traumatic injury, but addiction isn't an acute disease, it's a chronic disease. Chronic diseases can't be cured, they can only be managed. And that's what I needed. I needed recovery management. And that's what these slices of cheese are. Each one is a different form of recovery management. That's why the pilots and doctors do so well. They formalize this process. They leave nothing to chance.
John was one of the critical people who helped me precisely when I needed his help the most. But John wasn't the only one. There were several people who just seemed to appear at exactly the right moment and knew just what to say.
The day after I got caught by the Navy stealing Demerol, and it was pretty clear that I was going to lose everything, I wasn't feeling very good about myself. In fact, I was pretty suicidal. And it was right about that time that I got a call from a Navy psychiatrist, a captain, here at the Naval Hospital San Diego. He asked me to come and talk with him, and so I did. He was kind, he was understanding, and he said one of those things that has always stayed with me, and it fits very well with what John said about planning for the times when we might be weak and the times that we're strong. The psychiatrist said, plan for relapse. And I've always wanted to know, what did he mean by that exactly? Well, let's go ask him.
Dr. Bill Haining is now a professor of psychiatry at the University of Hawaii Medical School. My meeting with Bill that day may very well have saved my life.
But you had said something that has always stayed with me, and that was plan for relapse. What did you mean by that?
You have to understand that most people who get into that recovery phase, who get well, get sick again. And that's not necessarily as terrible a thing as it sounds, that it is an expected outcome, and that if and when I have a patient, I have the sense to say, look, the odds are that you're going to, in fact, use again. Don't get depressed about that. In fact, prove me wrong. I would be delighted to be proved wrong. And with any luck, if you are pissed off enough at me for saying that and assiduous enough about the workload in front of you, you will prove me wrong, and you'll go on to be an eternal success. On the other hand, if you are like most other people, you're going to resist the idea of being an addict or an alcoholic. And that's going to take some interesting forms, including proving to yourself somehow that you can use again, or just getting a little bit careless. So we have to plan for this, and with each and every relapse build on the plan, because I will tell you that as imperfect as the recovery process is now, there is really good justification for this assertion. If you are sufficiently persistent, you will get well.
I've never been more impressed with the anger that I sometimes get from family members or therapists. When I say, plan for relapse, they think that I'm, giving people permission to relapse.
Yeah.
What would your answer be if you said plan for relapse to a parent or someone like that and they said, how dare you?
A certain amount of the reluctance to accept the notion that there will be a relapse comes from two sources. One is the obvious limitations of our field. Like I said, we're not nearly as smart as we need to get right now on how to get people well. But there's another consideration here, which is that it's the feeling of every parent, which is you don't want your kid to be that sick. Why did this have to happen to my kid? This hurts like hell. I don't want this. And every time you remind me of this, it's a little like PTSD, or it's a little like opening a wound again. You're suggesting to me that my kid won't necessarily get well. You need to be the one rational person in their life who actually realizes that this is a relapsing illness and be prepared for that eventuality. And to the degree that you are prepared for it, I can virtually promise you that your kid will end up getting better. Can I tell you one more example of the kind of thinking that goes along? So like I train general psychiatry residents. They commonly get methamphetamine dependent individuals. And they get these guys who've been coming through the emergency room who are really ill. They're having psychotic symptoms. They're hearing things and seeing things that aren't there. Their behavior is out of control. They may be violent. You put them inside the hospital, which is a safe area, and you give them some medications to create a little more relaxation, and then you begin to present them with the illness state that brought them in, which is the methamphetamine dependence that they have. And a surprising number of them, they get it. They go, wow, thanks, Doc. I really get it this time. I'm on top of it. What do I need to do? You need to go into a treatment facility. Okay, let's make the arrangements. God bless you. Thank you. So they go forward with this, go out the front door with the directions to the treatment facility in their hand, and at least in Honolulu, what they will do after they leave the Queens Medical Center is they will turn left to go down to A'ala Park, which is essentially our shooting gallery downtown, score some meth, and start over again. And then the resident comes into the office and says, damned addicts, they just are so unreliable. They lie to you and they tell you one thing and they tear your heart out because then they go out and they use again. All right, I don't want to be a doctor anymore. I said, oh, wait a minute, it really wasn't about you. When they said, I am going to go get well, at that moment, they were going to go get well. And then when they left the front door of the hospital and you were no longer there in close proximity to them, telling them what the process was, they turned left and went to A'ala Park. This describes a frequent occurrence in psychiatry, which is the phenomenon of ambivalence, and that is that they've got two voices going on in their head at any given time. Depending on which voice you are listening to at any moment governs whether or not you go over the hill to the treatment facility with the directions in your hand, or you end up turning left and going to A'ala Park. And when they relapse, it's not necessarily because you haven't done your job. It's because for a while there they had a louder input from the voice that said they can't live without that stuff.
Somewhere between 40 to 60% of people who successfully complete treatment, even inpatient treatment, will have at least one relapse in their first year after discharge. I've met lots of people who leave treatment and never relapse. Relapse does not have to be part of recovery. But I had to face reality. It was a risk. And so I had to have a plan in place to offset that risk. And then I could hope I never used it.
What I watched the doctors in diversion do was plan for relapse. In fact, they signed a contract stipulating everything that was required of them. What would happen if they did those things and what the consequences would be if they didn't. A relapse is like an engine fire warning light in the Hornet. What does the pilot do? He goes to his NATOPS pocket checklist and goes down each item. You don't think about it, you don't take shortcuts, you just do it exactly as written. And if you do, the fire should go out. And if it doesn't, you can leave the plane. The same thing with a relapse. I just go to my safety checklist. I don't argue, I don't take shortcuts, I do it exactly as written beforehand. And if I do that, I can keep the relapse from becoming catastrophic. But to be clear, the relapse has to be caught quickly and it has to end definitively. Relapse is not good, but clandestine relapse can be a disaster. This is the relapse that smolders, that no one really knows about. The patient is too ashamed or too scared to tell anyone, and it goes on for weeks and months. That's the kind of relapse that can destroy everyone's morale. It doesn't have to happen. With a good relapse plan, you can prevent it.
The state of Utah has its own professional health program. It is managed by Dr. Charles Walton. Dr. Walton was another one of the people I came into contact with in my early sobriety who said something that ended up being very important.
Can you tell me what you meant by that when you said get a doc?
I don't believe we can be completely objective when we're taking care of ourselves, and I extend it to first-degree relatives. I just simply believe that physicians should not be taking care of themselves or taking care of first-degree relatives. In the recovering physician, I think it's really critical that you maintain your physical health and that you maintain your mental and emotional health. And so when I say get a doc, I guess I really mean get doc's doc. Got to have an addiction medicine specialist, perhaps a good nurse practitioner who's familiar with addiction issues. You need someone like that in your corner, who knows your story, who knows what you've been through, and who's almost a sponsor of sorts, but can take care of your emotional and mental health.
So an addiction medicine specialist is a physician who specializes in the treatment, prevention, or in the research of addiction. And they specialize in some aspect of the illness, whether it's from, an internal medicine, a psychiatric, a pediatric standpoint. There are a lot of medications that should be avoided in recovery, and people tend to not know about this. A physician without knowledge of addiction is more likely to prescribe something like Zolpidem for sleep, which, I've treated a lot of people with addiction just as Zolpidem. So it's an addicting drug, and it shouldn't be used in recovery. There should be things that are used that don't tap into that pleasure-reward pathway. So an addiction medicine specialist is much more likely going to avoid things like that.
While someone is in treatment, we know that they can clean up pretty well. While they're in active treatment, whether it's intensive outpatient or whether it's inpatient, while they're actively involved and engaged, most people can stop their primary drug of choice. It's when they graduate, and now suddenly if they're turned free again, things will deteriorate extremely quickly. The recidivism rate is 90% plus. I mean, if treatment centers were honestly telling us what was happening, that's how high it would be if they don't follow these people. So ongoing care, continuing care, aftercare, number of names. Meetings, it's groups, it's individual therapy, it's meeting with an addiction medicine specialist. Something going on fairly frequently every month for years. Years with an S. Years and years.
So how do I put all of this together? What does a good recovery management plan look like?
I had the 6 slices of cheese from the Blueprint studies in the HIMSS program. I also found a few more in this book, the Addiction Recovery Management book, edited by John Kelly and Bill White. And I had the things that people had said to me, those memos to my future self to help me stay on track.
John had said, in the times we're strong, we plan for the times we might be weak. And so the first slice of cheese was treatment. The doctors went to inpatient treatment for 90 days. The pilots, at least 30 days. I did 4 months of inpatient treatment at John's Treatment Center.
Treatment laid the foundation for everything that was to come. Treatment also taught me a language that I could use to describe what I was going through and understand what other people were going through. Treatment taught me the concepts and practices of recovery. I came out of treatment with a strong recovery literacy. Treatment also got me strong again. I had what's called recovery capital. These are all the things that I could summon in myself and in my environment to stay sober.
But now I needed to find a therapist or recovery coach, someone I could give permission to call me on my behavior, someone I could report problems to and work through them.
For this to work, my therapist or coach has to be my advocate. They have to work for me, not probation, not my family. They have to fight for me if need be.
The doctors and pilots had that therapist/coach/advocate. They engaged in what are called recovery management checkups. Every month, the pilots went to a peer monitoring group, and every week, the doctors went to a diversion meeting.
Without a license, I couldn't go to diversion groups. So instead, I went to a separate recovering professionals group, run by the same therapist that ran the diversion meetings. I had to check in every week.
And my therapist knows other things that can help me get through early sobriety.
The most important job of that therapist or recovery coach is to have an encyclopedic knowledge of all the recovery support services that are available in their community. So here in Utah, not only do we have good 12-step meetings, but a variety of other mutual support meetings. Some of them are faith-based, such as LDS Family Services and Celebrate Recovery. Others are secular, such as LifeRing and Smart Recovery. We have an increasing number of good sober living homes and doctors who like treating people in recovery. The University of Utah has a substance use disorder counseling program. There are family support services, vocational services, and mental health services. This is called a recovery-oriented system of care. It's a coordinated network of community-based services designed to support people in recovery and their families.
The Kelly White book gives evidence that safe, sober housing is critical to success in recovery. So in my early recovery, where I live matters.
The Orange County Probation Department allowed me to live in one of their approved sober living houses in lieu of jail. I didn't like it, but I have to admit it did help. Now, sober living homes can be poorly run and risky, but there is an organization that's trying to change that.
There are many pathways to recovery, abstinence being a major pathway. And so recovery residences are sober, safe, peer-supportive living environments that support that pathway to recovery. So one of the things that the National Alliance of Recovery Residents has done, or NAR, is we have identified the different types of recovery residences that are found across the United States. When we look at people returning from prisons or hospitals or inpatient or even outpatient programs, and they're going back into the environments or in the relationships that enable addictive lifestyles, then how are we going to act surprised when someone relapses or someone struggles in their recovery? I think it's so important to, take someone out of their culture of addiction and transplant them into a culture of recovery. And that's what recovery residences can do.
Throughout the Kelly White book, the research is very clear. When it comes to recovery success, who my friends are matters.
Peer group is critical to staying sober. The pilots and doctors immerse themselves in the fellowship of their recovering peers through 12-step meetings.
Like a lot of people, I didn't like meetings at first. But pretty soon I realized the people there knew how to do something that I didn't. They knew how to stay sober. So that's why I went to meetings, because that's where the people who knew how to stay sober went.
Today, there are many different kinds of mutual support groups. I can pick whichever one is right for me, but I have to go. I can't isolate. I need that intense, sometimes painful social interaction to heal my frontal cortex, to recalibrate my social cognition. Bill had said, plan for relapse. The pilots and doctors all had a relapse plan designed to detect relapse early and intervene quickly and definitively. Now you might ask, with all that I had hanging over my head, that prosecutor, probation, prison, did I relapse? I did relapse. It was only a day and no one ever found out about it because no one drug tested me. And so at my moment of greatest need, no one knew what was going on with me. And that shaped all of my thinking about the next thing that the doctors and pilots did, testing. The pilots and doctors were tested frequently, randomly, and for a prolonged period of time, at least 5 years. If I do relapse, how fast someone finds out about it and helps me could save my life. And if I stay sober, now I have an objective record of just how hard I've worked. This was something that the doctors in diversion always said. Build a paper trail. This is a key principle of safety science and recovery management, collecting objective evidence of what's going on with the patient. So the recovering professionals group that I went to on a weekly basis, they tested me. So I had that record. There are local laboratories or recovery aftercare programs or therapists and coaches that can provide testing. And they can rule out false positives so the testing doesn't become a weapon used against the person in recovery. A drug test is a medical procedure. It can cause real harm to the patient if it's done incorrectly. So it has to be done by a healthcare professional who knows how to correctly interpret the result. When I was a flight surgeon, one of the things we always said was, get the pilot back in the cockpit. As soon as he was safe, we wanted that pilot back in the cockpit, doing the thing that he was good at, because we knew that's a big part of his recovery. For the doctors in diversion too, going back to work was a big part of their recovery capital. Now, a lot of people argue that the only reason these programs work is because you're dealing with high-level professionals like doctors and pilots. They've already achieved something in their life, and they don't want it taken away. But it's not just doctors and pilots who enjoy these phenomenal success rates in recovery. College students do too.
I think when you look at a collegiate population, when you think about what are the ground floor necessities in order for them to recover and continue in education. And I think our research has been very specific about that. Number one is social support. At that time in their life, one of the most important driving forces in their life is belonging. And collegiate recovery communities provide that. The second thing is, and it sounds really kind of minor, but it's huge, and it's just companionship. People to do things with. When you walk into a college campus and you think about finding a way for yourself or a place for yourself, that's hard to do if you're clean and sober. So the social support gives them a sense of being around other people that are doing similar things, but then at that next level, that sense of companionship allows them to live what I would call a normal college life without the chemicals. The other thing that's real important is being validated. And there's a sense of validation in that. I'm a person, I am in recovery, I've been accepted to a university, and I'm part of a group. I will never forget this. I was leaving graduation one day and I had my cap and gown on, and one of the other faculty members across the parking lot yelled at me. I'm not sure I can tell us without crying. He yelled at me and he said, I want to ask you something. Aren't you the one that runs that program for those kids that have substance abuse problems? And I said, well, yes, but they're in recovery from those problems. And he said, no, I know. He said, I want to tell you, if that program existed not for anybody but the one student of yours I had in my class, it was worth it. And he said, I've never had a student as gifted and as talented as, and he said this young man's name. And he said, thank you for all you do, because he deserved a chance at an education. And he's now finished a PhD.
The pilots, the doctors, and the college students all have the same advantage that boosts their chances of long-term recovery. They have a future. They got back to work. They went back to school. They all had the same opportunity to strive for the thing that gave their life meaning and purpose. Taking that opportunity away makes things less safe for all of us. Access to health care is critical for one's chances at long-term recovery. Dr. Walton had said, get a doc, and the doctors and pilots all had access to an addiction medicine specialist who understood the special needs of people in recovery and could help them with medications to reach their goal of abstinence. There are several of these now, and one of them is a medication to help people in recovery from alcohol and opioid use disorders.
So extended release naltrexone is an opioid antagonist and basically gives you a depot dose of naltrexone that's slowly released over a 30-day period, which will do two things. It will block the action of opioids, and the other thing is it will decrease craving to alcohol and opioids and maybe other drugs, we're not sure.
I found an addiction medicine specialist and I saw him regularly. He knew that all the doctors in diversion who were opioid dependent took naltrexone, and so he suggested that I take it, and so I did. For me, this medication was an important strategy to cope with craving, as well as a last-ditch barrier to relapse. Now, I didn't like everything that my doctor suggested. For instance, he told me that it would benefit my recovery to quit some of my old habits.
Nicotine cessation has always been a really controversial issue in the addiction field from the standpoint of people who are doing the treatment. As far as the research goes, it's not controversial. It's clear that if you stop smoking or using tobacco in any other form, that you are more likely to attain and maintain sobriety. And that's just the bottom line. People don't like to hear that because they have all the conventional wisdom of, oh, you know, don't give up everything at once and everything. But I've just seen through the years that patients will use the nicotine as a mood-altering drug when they have nothing else to go to. And I think it keeps that process going in the brain. And I've also had plenty of friends who got into recovery from everything except nicotine and then later went in and stopped using nicotine. And their level of recovery deepened. It was amazing. They were amazed themselves. They were really unaware of how much they were numbing themselves with the nicotine.
Now, I don't smoke, but I have a lot of sympathy for my brothers and sisters in recovery who do smoke, because I have a problem that is just as bad and just as dangerous with this.
Sugar and actually just compulsive overeating, I think, is a big problem in people that stop using drugs or alcohol. And in the addiction field, a lot of us talk about playing whack-a-mole. You know, you get this in remission, but then it pops up over here. And where does it pop up? It can pop up, if you're not using drugs or alcohol, then sex, it can pop up with sugar, gambling, shopping.
Okay, I admit it. I have a problem with sugar. I struggle with this every day. I know it's bad for me. I know it puts my recovery at risk. And I know that if I don't quit, the drug that is most likely to kill this recovering addict is right here. I quit, I make it a while, I relapse, but then I try to quit again. I don't quit quitting. I don't like hearing it, but I need to listen to what my doctor is telling me. I need to quit, and my doctor can suggest medications to help me do that. My last slice of cheese I found in my favorite chapter in the Kelly White book. It was written by Dr. Rudolph Moose at Stanford University. He describes the social processes at work in the lives of people in long-term recovery. One of the things these people do is engage in healthy, rewarding activities as an alternative to, and that compete with, continued drug use. I needed to learn to play. So when I moved to Utah, I skied. Not because I was any good at it, but because my recovery depended on it. I call this hedonic rehabilitation, making a deliberate, concerted effort to practice normal, pleasurable activities.
Well, I made it. The slices of cheese worked. Although I never really knew which slice of cheese was working at any one time. But over time, all of the slices were important. So the combination really was critical. Now, I would love to tell you that it was one big decision that I made to stay sober. But at least for me, that's not the way it was. It was a series of little decisions. It was very incremental, and there were milestones along the way. Each of those milestones was a choice that, if I made it correctly, made the next one a little easier. I wish I could make one big decision to stay sober and stick with it. But that's not how choice works. I have to break down the big choice into a whole bunch of little ones. And that's what recovery management is. If I do these things, I will be fine. Because the brain is a very forgiving organ. With the right kind of support, it will heal. And as John said, life gets better. And the promises of recovery really will start to come true. One of the rewards of recovery is that we get to meet the people whose words sustained us at very dark times. And at the top of my list was Bill White. Why do you think the professional health programs work?
You know, the professional health programs were the first part of the treatment sector and the intervention sector that really began to shift from an acute care emergency room model of addiction treatment to really understand the need for a model of sustained recovery management over time. For a large number of people, that acute care model, that we continually recycle them through without measurable long-term recovery outcomes. And we've blamed them for their lack of response to it, when I really look at that as a systems failure. In the same way that we would blame somebody for not getting well, providing them only half of the antibiotics necessary. And like antibiotics, if you take a small dose of them, you can temporarily suppress symptoms, as we do with acute care addiction treatment. But there's a tendency for those conditions to then return in a much more virulent and untreatable form. So I think the innovation with the professional assistance programs was it combined a number of elements together that really understood addiction as a chronic disorder that requires sustained vigilance and active management. And those tremendously high recovery outcomes we've got from those programs raises the question, why can't other citizens of this country have access to those same elements that have provided such incredibly high long-term recovery outcomes? What we're seeing now that I think is really significant and exciting to me is the emergence of new recovery support institutions. So we're seeing recovery community centers and recovery residences, recovery schools, recovery ministries, recovery industries, recovery cafes. I mean, this is a whole menu of new recovery support services that we haven't historically seen. So I'm very excited to see sort of this expanding culture of recovery in the United States that I think is going to widen the doorways to recovery support for an awful lot of people.
For so many people in recovery, Bill's work and the work of his colleagues gave voice to the things we knew in our hearts were true. They allowed us to see ourselves in a new light, helped us believe that we were more than our past mistakes, and opened the door to an amazing future where we could take this terrible tragedy and turn it into something good, something that could make the world a more humane place.
When we have the Rally for Recovery at the Utah State Capitol, there's this incredible energy that comes to the Capitol. And in fact, somebody one time said, "I'm not sure you should do this up here." And I said, well, let me tell you something. Imagine you being a person who is recovering from a substance use disorder and or alcoholism that now has your life back. You're no longer using substances. You actually are not incarcerated, and your family is back in your life, and you're working and living in your community without the kind of problems you used to have. I said, you would be celebrating. You would be excited too. This is what we want to promote here, so that our legislators and the people who make policies see that with treatment services, with recovery support services, with continued prevention, that people get better. We celebrated at a community level. We have a big event throughout September, but we would like to help people understand it and have a greater awareness, so we reduce the stigma about it. People with addiction being bad people. They're people with an illness that get better, and once they get better and they find recovery, they become incredible contributors to not only their family but their community.
So what does it mean for someone as a pilot or a physician to suddenly enter in relationships with other physicians and pilots in long-term recovery and seeing how their lives have been transformed, and have those individuals serve as almost what I call recovery carriers who make recovery contagious? So it's not the push force of pain or threat, it's really the pull force of these charismatic individuals in recovery that really provide living proof about what life in recovery can look like.
Well, I think it's a really exciting time to be in the recovery industry or in recovery. We're getting traction, folks. I mean, people are talking about it. People, celebrities, politicians, people in the community are, stepping up and saying, I'm a person in long-term recovery, and this is what it means to me. And I'm speaking up because people that are still struggling with the disease need to know that recovery is possible. And with the right supports, recovery should be expected.
These are the kids that are going to change the world, because they have been to hell and back. And they get it. I mean, they get it. And they're serious. And to them, an education is not just a degree. I mean, to them, an education is a second chance to have a life. It's a do-over, to have a life that they always maybe dreamed of or never, ever thought they could have had.
I think I've always considered myself a cheerleader for recovery, now more than ever. And it just it wakes me up every day. I am not shy about talking about recovery, and I do it every chance I get. You can just ask my family. I'm not very quiet about it, and I want to encourage others to do the same.
This is an exciting time to get sober. And as individuals, as we emerge from our addiction into recovery, and as a nation, as we emerge from the drug war into a kind of recovery, times are changing, and it's exciting to be part of that. We have paid a terrible price for what we know, and we have made mistakes along the way, all of us. What I like about the safety perspective is that it understands that, and it gives us a way to learn from our mistakes. Now, I don't want to imply that I have the recipe for sobriety. I do not. These were things that I watched other people doing along the way who were successful. There are many paths to recovery, and there's no wrong door to go through to start down that path. Some of these things may be right for you, or not. The point is, if you absolutely have to stay sober, it is possible. In fact, people do it all the time. Recovery is not rare, and it's not random. With the right kind of support, it might even be the rule. The pilots, the doctors, the college students, they are an elite group, but the things that they got are not that hard to give to everyone. They are not that expensive relative to the cost of not doing them. We just have to choose to do that. Or rather, we have to make a lot of little choices to do that, because that is the way choice works, and that is the way the brain heals. And that's the way we, as individuals, and as families, and as a nation, will heal.